Welcome to Idea Citizen. Today, I'm speaking with Ricardo Batista, and we're talking about practical strategies for building high-performing teams.
So I'm an engineer by background. So I grew up in Lisbon, did my engineering there, did a bit of my master's in Stockholm, and then I came back to Lisbon, worked for a few years in the telecom, and then the little bug of you gotta build something or you gotta be in a smaller business started to tickle. I joined a startup as a marketing director, which I didn't know anything of, but because marketing these days is a lot more analytical, it became natural to me. I then went back into technology again. I became chief product officer of that company. And then I got an invitation to manage Glovo, which is a sort of a DoorDash, a local DoorDash in Spain, but it's spread across Europe. And I was tasked to manage the whole country. Back then, this was 15 people, a few million of revenue. And then in 2.5 years, we turned it into 100 plus people and $65 million of revenue, I believe, back then.
Congratulations. That's no small feat to take that really from zero to 65 million. That's a big number.
Well, I had a little bit of help in what it regards to the pandemic. So I literally joined before the pandemic. Then obviously this was, DoorDash also exploded. So it was slightly easier for us in theory. In practice, we didn't really have a team. So this whole performance management theme became more of a thing when I started to have to play against the big guys. Back then it was Uber Eats, and I had to play against them with, I think, less than half of the team,
Absolutely.
they had a lot more market share. So it was a fierce battle. It had to be on people. I had to
Yeah.
rely on people.
Well, what is it? I mean, they do say that, I guess we can say that you're lucky. I think when you look at the definition of lucky, or I don't know, someone famous said it, but it's like when opportunity and skills or something combine at the right point, and then it's like you have like the spark ultimately. But let's be honest, high performing teams are not built in a silo, and obviously that's what we're really going to talk about. I think that there's like a lot of lip service to performance and high performing and leadership and everything. And I think that a lot of times the conversations really kind of go into it from kind of an aspirational standpoint. But there's ultimately like a tactical component to it that really plays in. And it's like until you fully have ingrained it or lived it or even been through an organization that was truly high performing, you really kind of have to start somewhere. And it's not just, I don't think this comes out of, I think there's no magic pill that will actually make this happen. It's practice, deliberate practice, continuously adjusting. So I'm very curious to kind of hear like your background and like how you've ultimately been able to do that. To start though, too, I am curious to know from your perspective, like, how do you define a high performing team? What does that look like to you?
So I think the easiest definition, and it doesn't mean that it's not true, is a team that meets their objectives and are driven by those objectives. So I think that's the most basic definition. If we were to see, or at least from the teams that I've seen that are highest performance, you typically see two other things that I think make them successful and also sort of fuel the first part. First of all, radical candor, and this was something sort of immortalized by Kim Scott in her book. So this openness and you will need to have hard conversations with each other, and this radical candor makes it a lot easier in the day-to-day management and fuels the whole objective drivenness. And then one thing that when this wheel starts spinning and you get radical candor and then the objectives are coming and you're meeting them, these teams tend to become, and it's sort of a byproduct of it, but also it is very correlated to them, is they become self-sufficient by nature, as in you don't really need to rely on your top management to make the decisions. The decisions sort of come, I wouldn't say bottom up, but within clusters of people that have the capability to make that decision. Then if we any given example, right? I think it all comes to our heads that a head of operations and a head of marketing can make wonders just between the two of them without involving anyone else, right? I would say those are the three things. Some of them are sort of byproducts of the others.
So yeah, pretty clear. Like we have a few clear kind of benchmarks and everything. And I like those. Of course, like that's not, that list is not, does not encapsulate every single various variation. Of course, like different teams have different needs. But what do you feel like, I like to call it kind of the shiny new object. I think people are, or at least sometimes teams or leaders or new leaders or just individual contributors too. I think people are, can sometimes be distracted by this shiny new objects. Do you feel like there's any sort of what I call shiny new objects in terms of like from a management standpoint today that you think that people are being like distracted by, that you're like, no, 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 let's just go back to like, some solid key principles?
You mean social media wise?
Yeah, or at least like, I mean, or even in your circles, I think there's a little bit of noise around, like it feels a little bit like us versus them, and there's a little bit of noise around just like authoritative leadership. There's a little bit of noise about return to office. There's noise around some of these different things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I can probably think of two. One of them is return to office, right? So you mentioned it. It's sort of a parallel discussion. It shouldn't really change much of your business goals, and I think these days it's either a fundamental change or getting back to the roots of the companies, right? Most of the companies started when they were small in the office, then they became big, then the pandemic came, and now I see the return to office as either being the founders really wanting to get that back and potentially returning to office is a way to get that back. Some others I see it as a way to say, okay, we need to trim the team and a few have to go, and this is the way we enforce it without actually doing a hard measure. Another thing that I really found interesting, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but there was a recent talk by the Airbnb co-founder about the founder mode, which is this.
I don't know what this is. No, tell me.
Okay, so then this got crystallized by Paul Graham, the founder of YC, an article that he writes about how companies grow into some size and then become, let's say, evangelized to hire what we call professional managers. So people that have been in other corporations have done the same thing, and they will create this culture. And the whole thesis was these professional managers then bring a battalion of 30 people with them, bring in efficiencies and so on. And these companies only get back on track when their founder takes over again.
Mm.
It has happened in a lot of companies. A lot of companies also suffer from having professional managers that actually don't know the business. Now, this became wild on social media, mostly because it was interpreted as being the authoritative founder getting back to the battlefield and firing people and leaning the company. It really depends, right? It's this one. I do understand what Paul was saying in this founder mode
So what do you think he was
essay.
trying to say? I mean, simply.
Mostly, I think there's two aspects of it, right? So there's a lot of bloating in big organizations. It's true. Like
Yes,
we
yes.
face that every day with our customers. There's a lot of people that fundamentally are not incrementally driving the business, whether that's a founder or a returned founder coming in and fixing that, or it's an actual good CEO doing that. For me, it doesn't really matter. But indeed, I think that the topic is if we were to run big companies by what the initial founders did, things could work out better. Unknown, right? I don't. I try not to put myself in a position because it really depends on each case.
Right, right.
Now, what is true is there's a lot of bloating, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So
And I totally track with what you're saying. And I think, I mean, I think with bloating, I think really comes down to like where I go to is actually some of, your key benchmarks of a high performing team. But it's like, if you have a team that has bloat and you've hired well, and, we'll go into some of that as well. But it's like, if you've hired well and you've hired for people that you trust and that you value their input and their contributions, I anticipate, or at least my goal within an organization would be that those people then, if they acknowledge that, like, hey, I'm in a situation that I've got I have extra bandwidth that I can do things, I anticipate that if you're hiring for the right people, that those people ultimately should be and are in a number of instances actually reinvesting that additional time or efficiencies into the organization to find solutions and close certain gaps that may be happening. So for example, it's like, yes, hey, as an organization, we've identified, say, like, hey, here's our five our most important objectives and directions that we're driving in. If we've hit all of those, or if the individual contributor or the various different management people have addressed their components of that, my thinking is that then, okay, then that additional, say, 30% bloat or that extra time that you have in your schedule, I anticipate that that time should be used to ideate, conceptualize, maybe brainstorm and execute on some additional things to ladder up into those various different objectives and build them out. So I'm always on the fence if bloat by definition, I think, is a dirty word. Nobody really likes it. But I also think that, like, in where possible, and I think this is the luxury of somewhat of a larger organization, where there is bloat and where there is the luxury of time or perspective, I think that there's a nice opportunity to build out or enhance whatever the offering is of that company. So say, you're talking about that, you guys are in food delivery and everything, that the opportunity to bring additional features or functionality or drive whatever ultimately the bottom line is that you're trying to get at. I think that there are opportunities to do that with bloat, but like the challenge too within like a kind of like startup methodology from my perspective is that startup methodology by nature is a little haphazard. I think it's a little bit everybody burning the midnight fuel and midnight oil, excuse me. And I think that startup by nature ends up you're kind of you're kind of operating on a little bit of steam. And I don't think that there's good and bad of it. But the thing is that like you don't have bloat, but you also don't have time to really think through and strategize. Like it's a little disorganized, it's a little chaotic. I think that there's good that comes from that, and then there's also bad. So it's like you got finding out ultimately like what ends up being the right level for any organization. Have you found good ways to either leverage or take care of that bloat? Like, what do you do? Like, do you add more things onto the roadmap? Do you do layoffs? Like what makes sense? Like, do you evangelize your people to like, maybe like, let's call it like do like a version of a hackathon? Like, what do you do there?
Yeah, so there's a few misconceptions in I think it starts with hiring, right? So there's a few misconceptions that I would probably note down. So and I think a few of these angry founders going into founder mode end up.
I like that, angry founders.
It happens to a lot of them. I think it boils down to, from what I've seen in the patterns of these angry founders, is they have over relied on past experience to hire a person and did not set okay, this person has a advantage in the end for having this past experience, but whatever this person brings from now on is going to be completely new. This is a new business, this is a new
Right.
company, a new culture, and so on. And I see, and it happened to me as well in the past, which is I tend to stick to that narrative for too long. But this person has done this in the previous company, so he's going to do this. Well, we just need to wait enough time. And what is typically very common, and it's a correlation, not a causation, you can see people don't drastically change performance. You can see in the first months, if that past experience has been helping this person get more out of his or her performance, or is actually draining down. And that happens a lot, right? So you're stuck into the whole mindset and you're not adapting to the new company. And this is what I see in these angry founders is typically this case, right? So they don't really make the hard decision of saying, to that person, you're sticking yourself too much on your past experience and you should let that go, or even to make the tough decision of this is not the right fit, right? So and this happened to us several times and keeps on happening. So yeah, I think I would probably frame it down like that.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk two things. I mean, is angry founder like a common term, by the way? Is that like I will say, like, okay, I was gonna say, I'm like, aside from this conversation, I'm like, I haven't come across it, and I was like, is this a thing that I have missed? But I mean, I think people are frustrated. I think being a founder of any organization, I think is a really lonely place to be in, and I think it can suck a lot. I'm not saying that, like, yeah, I mean, everybody else has their various different roles in an organization, but I don't know. I am the daughter of a business owner, and I will say that, you are responsible to make sure that people's, salaries get paid and everything. Like there's so many of these different things that like come into it that it's a tough job as well. But Also, a little tiny violin, nobody really cares.
I would frame angry founders, angry as being not an adjective of the founder, but at the situation, which is typically they go on Twitter and on LinkedIn and rant, and that's when they become angry. They need to get back to their jobs, and it's a hard job. Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree.
a good therapist helps. um, so that's, you've mentioned before, and or like you've been speaking to kind of team performance, or at least like let's call it, yes, individual performance. So like, what does, like if we're talking about like objectives and team performance and everything, like I think as an organization it's crucial for, number one, the organization at large to have like clear objectives of like what everybody's driving towards, but then the roles and responsibilities of of teams, and then as well as individuals. Like, what have you seen a really great successful way of tracking for performance and deliverables, whatever that may be? Like, do we need more meetings? Do we need another chart? Like, what does it look like?
Well, we covered part of it, right? So it needs to be super specific. And I've, when not going into a bit of a promotional part, but we do help these companies, smaller and medium businesses, actually set up these key performance indicators. And the typical things that they fail at is, first of all, they don't make them specific. So, I can see a very generic term like, let's improve customer churn, but they don't really make it into a number. Then obviously, and I get a lot of pushback on this one, which is, oh, but this is a sort of a qualitative metric, so we cannot really measure. And I haven't found up to this date anything that cannot be measured.
I
I mean,
agree. I agree. I'm totally tracking with you. Yes. I mean, and to your point, the example of customer experience, it's like, well, how many complaints are we getting? Like, has that changed? What are the things have you gotten pushback on that people are like, oh, we can't track this? Like, we can't provide like a clear measurable, like measure, like what is that?
the most common one, so typically operations and sales teams are easier because they already have their metrics. Technology teams are the toughest because they always
Okay.
say, but we don't really have metrics, so we ship features. When I come down to it is, so is the platform up? I mean, is the infrastructure actually providing the service? Okay, that's a metric. Second, are you shipping X features? What are these features? If you've shipped it, it's a 1. If you didn't ship, it's a 0.
Right.
There's a
Right.
number to it. So
Right.
you can all boil down. I understand that the topic of technology teams, especially at early stages in which there's a lot of experimentation, but then it's again a work of putting that experimentation in a package, right? What are you trying to achieve? Typically there's either you're trying to acquire new customers, or you're trying to reducing your churn, or increasing your LTV, whatever. There's a metric to it. What technology departments tend to avoid is, I don't want to get into business metrics. Those are business metrics, but they probably should, right?
Well, and we're all in business at the end of the day. We're hired for, like, there is a tool, whatever it is, whether it's technology, whether it's consumer packaged goods, whether it's an app, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's this pen. And, and I think that like that really comes down to leadership. I mean, leadership, and like, let's even call it C-suite. Like, C-suite has a really big role in terms of like making it very clear ultimately, like, what are these objectives. And I don't, of course, every organization operates different, but like you were kind of speaking to technology, and technology teams, I've seen it as well. Like, it can be a challenge, because I also think sometimes tech teams, it's people want to rebuild things, and it's like to make it, for whatever reason, more efficient or prettier or whatever, which I do think that there is a place for that. But oftentimes it's like, all right, the product is working. Let's say, hey, these are like the 5 objectives to build these things, but then people want to build out other different things. And you're like, no, 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 no. Like, those things do not matter until we do these things. And I understand there's like this interconnection and efficiencies, this and that. But it's like, if whatever that fix is doesn't actually provide like a better customer experience, then it should be tabled. Like, don't worry about it. I understand, just like for us personally, I think sometimes we want to do something because like we want something to look better. After you've learned something, you can go back and do it better. But you just have to table it and focus on like what the other objectives are, and keep going there.
But just wanting to complement with an example. And that's a work that is probably more troublesome for tech teams. And even what you mentioned, right? So refactors, let's rebuild the infrastructure, etc. There's a lot of ongoing talks on that. Just put a number to it, right? So there's potentially a business benefit of doing that. We just did it one in our company. We had to stop everything for 2 weeks because whatever was coming next was going to take double the time. And probably the next feature would take double the time. So, okay, let's stop this for 2 weeks. We refactor it, and that's fine. The customer is not going to notice anything, but it's just going to make us move faster. But we had to actually measure how fast would we go after that, right? And this sizing is not always straightforward, but needs to be done. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Like, let's call it like then like smaller and larger organizations, you have a set of leadership that have, in theory, like, say like you have your founder that's built out and brought on different people for this team to build like whatever this foundation is. And so like in terms of like building a foundation, at least that like leadership and then subsequently the larger organization is on board, like how does one do that? How does you build a team that has a solid foundation, that people have one another's backs, that like people understand ultimately what the objective is? I think that's such a hard thing to do. And it can be broken so easily.
It's incredibly hard, and it gets harder with more people you bring in.
Right.
The effort you need to do, it's probably exponential, right?
Ultimately,
I
we're talking
think
about culture a little bit here, foundation culture and everything. So it's like, in terms of building an organization, like, let me ask, because I feel like this kind of goes into like foundation and hiring and onboarding and everything. Like, I've had some situations where like I've been asked to take like various different like personality and aptitude tests and this and that. Like, what is your stance on some of these things? Like, do they, like, if you know that like you need like these types of people in this type of an organization, but let's be honest, also at the same time, people know how to game some of these questions. People know what the ultimate objective is at the end of the day. It's like, so one could, in theory, write out or at least say answer these various different questions in a manner that would be most appealing to an organization. So like, I don't know, how do you suss out like the authenticity of the people that you're bringing on board for the culture, whatever it is that you've built out?
Yeah, it's these are very subjective topics, so there's not a clear
Yeah,
answer.
but
What
like
I've
your
seen,
experience.
yeah, what I've seen is a correlation, or actually a reverse correlation, which is founders or directors or top management that do not live by the example, it just breaks apart. Okay, so when you're setting a culture, especially the founders need to lead by example at all times. Actually, the culture should be a copy of those founders,
Right, right,
and they should match almost 100% with that. That makes it a whole lot easier when it comes to cascading that down over the hirings of the level 1, level 2, and so on. You're not going to get a 100% match in all of them, but the closest you get, the better. Now, you're going to fail at it, and you just need to correct it. I think fundamentally, culture is so important, and we tend to overemphasize this with our customers. What you typically see is a flaw in culture leads to a flaw in performance, not the other way around.
hmm
I tend to, when it comes to hiring and how can we make sure the culture fit is 100%, it's going to be very, very difficult, right? So, and you also, if you're growing very fast, you also don't really have the luxury of time to go for that. You just need to make
right,
that correction, okay? So
right.
just make a probation period that is clear and there is a strong need, especially in smaller companies, for that culture fit to be super high. So there might be a correction, in 3 months or so. Whatever discrepancy you have to that 100% of culture is just going to cascade down into getting to the bottom line, and the bottom line is, or at least the lower levels are not going to be matching. So that's sort of the correlation that I see.
Yeah, absolutely. When you've been hiring for people, or at least like when you've been building out and expanding your teams, like what are you looking for? Like, at least like, let's say like, okay, so say like you're looking for somebody that has radical candor. Like, how do you get to a point with like, let's say interviewing somebody, or even just like building that type of a relationship on the onset? Like, how do you feel out for that? Like, that's a toughie. Because it's also, I mean, there's a power dynamic here. Let's be honest.
I tend to search for, so I always probe the candidates for a way in which I know that, or at least it's common that they will fail, to see how they recover from that failure. Okay, so make them lead, and typically it can be through a case or going into a live experience in which we discuss something that is happening right now and make them fail or at least go into a dead end they cannot get out of. And that kind of teaches two things, one for each side. One is it teaches me whether that person can actually recover from that and put himself up and come out of a good situation. And it also teaches that person how we tolerate failure, which depending on the organization, and especially if you're in a smaller organization, failure should be tolerated. Otherwise, you're not going to really understand what the market needs.
Yeah.
And I tend to, and this is maybe a personal touch, but I do see this pattern more and more in companies. Like Zuckerberg would say, our motto is failing fast, right? In the end, failure is the way that you also see that radical candorness, that openness. Am I willing to admit that I just failed? And by the way, the guy sitting right across is actually with a smile, happy that you failed and that you recovered from it. And I feel safe in a situation in which my potential manager is actually okay with this. So it kind of teaches both sides, right?
Yeah. That plays very much into, I feel like, the autonomy to make decisions, because if you don't have, it feels like it's cyclical ultimately at the end of the day, the radical candor, the autonomy to make decisions and fail and test and fail and like keep going. And, this is the thing. It's like you put out a few different things and something will hit. Something will hit. Of course, there's like the strategy, the research that goes into it, building a case, because ultimately you're going to have like resourcing going towards it. So it's not just a flippant decision just to kind of proceed in whatever direction that is, but the candor to like talk really like authentically about like pitfalls or certain issues, test it. Hopefully it works out great. You've like, built out whatever the autonomy to actually like built it out and then come back. I'm talking around this a little bit, but ultimately I do feel like there's a cyclical nature to that, where it's like the candor and the safety to actually be able to pitch, do something, potentially fail at it, to then having the autonomy to like build oneself back up and like conceptualize, say, like a new thing, whatever that offering is, a benefit to, say, the end consumer, the end customer, as well as the organization, to kind of keep all that moving. Yeah, yeah, I'm tracking for that.
Let me just add a point to that because I think it comes down. So my mom was a biology teacher, and I think Darwin's theory got into me, and it's very simple. So the most adaptable survives, right? So, and I think this is becoming more and more common. So I'm not looking for skill set. I'm not looking for potential. I'm looking for an adaptability. And I think it becomes more and more, as in, I still think that my dad was able to do civil engineering probably the same way that he did 30 years ago. I think this new generation and whatever's coming next is not going to have that luxury. AI is coming in and things are going to change. Marketing has changed in the last 20 years, and a CMO is completely different these days. And the rate of change is going to accelerate. So we're going to have to relearn and relearn. So learning is indeed what we're looking for, that adaptability, because everything else is definitely not granted.
So somebody, let's say, like getting out of university today, like how does, I guess, how does one train their brain for adaptability? Like, I think that's definitely like a core competency, that it's like not so much that you either have it or you don't, but I think ultimately you can work on it. There can be a practice of becoming adaptable. How does somebody work on that? Like, how does a new grad, I mean, think about this. I guess I like what you said there, but it's like I'm thinking about like, so say this new grad coming out of university, they've lived their operated their entire life with relatively, some very clear guardrails and everything. I sometimes find, depending on like, where you go or who your professors are in, after, at least in the US, high school, like, it's kind of an extension of high school. You're just older, or there isn't really that much autonomy in thinking, autonomy in dialogue, or let's say coursework. So you get out into the world, into like at least the professional world. And now there's this expectation for autonomy where, to some degree, you've never been provided any autonomy and been in a situation that you've needed to, I mean, relatively like be adaptable with like kind of higher stakes. how does one get there from living a life with like clear boundaries and everything? I mean, like not so much the necessity for adaptability, I think, or at least I would argue, has been relatively constrained. How do like there's a break point from like do you read a book? Like what do you do? What does somebody do?
I think it also, so when you get into the marketplace, sorry, the workplace, it also comes down to what managers you pick, or at least pick you, and you know the luck you get out of there.
Right.
But in the end, it's mostly about being allowed to experiment. And if and I, that experimentation will generate learnings, and that's how you become adaptable in that sense. So if AI comes in and you now have ChatGPT, can I do my job with ChatGPT? Let me just try and experiment. And I think that the ability to experiment, you know, back in the days I wanted to do an ad, I had to actually pay a company to do that. And these days you just get on TikTok and you understand there's ads there, and I
Yeah.
can do it for free.
It's almost like the worse they look, the better they are. Nobody wants, I mean, because
It's
let's be honest,
yeah.
like nobody wants to, like, I mean, I know like I'm coming, going but like people don't want super, like things like super polished anymore. It's like the more UGC things, user generated content things look like, the better it performs. Like times have changed. Even on Amazon, you'll see, you know, you used to only have perfect pictures. No, now here's like real people model, you know, it's like, it's different.
It just lowers the barrier to entry, but then it becomes
Yeah.
super difficult to actually compete in this. And I think it's a great psychology school in that sense. Like you really
Yeah.
need to think, how does the brain work? How do I get their attention? The hook is super important, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and, and, and
And the beauty
the
too, like, I
bottom
mean,
line,
the beauty, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like the beauty to that as well is that like the cost of entry, as I think you mentioned this, the cost of entry is super low. So might as well just put out a few different things and see what resonates. There's the A/B testing, I think, like nowadays for, let's say, concepts, ads, keywords, has never been cheaper. It's, you know, like it's relatively quick. Like you put a, you know, let's call it, pull $50, A/B test certain things. You'll know rather quickly what's doing better and what is worse. And then take those learnings and keep adapting and learning from there. But then also at the same time, don't rest on your laurels, because just as quickly as you figured out something that worked, it's going to change. So keep going. Always A/B test.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you know, if you know, our dads don't really know how to do TikTok. We barely do it. You know, I think it's just impressive how the cost of getting in is getting so low. And it's actually funny. We talk about this, like the founders in AI space actually talk about this, that AI will disrupt all of these things. We actually think the other way around, which is the more human assisted you can get, the more exposure you're going to have. Because now,
Can you
you know,
repeat?
people
Can you
just
repeat that one more time? Can you repeat that one more time?
so the more human assisted,
Human assisted.
exactly,
Got it.
your service can get, the greater exposure it will have, in the sense of, now I'm talking to a human. I was tired of talking to AIs and to robots, and you know, I just had a problem. Now I want to talk to a human, and so there's also that edge. We don't know what the future is going to look like, but there's clearly, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. I think that, yeah, I think there's an opportunity for, on a prior podcast call, I actually spoke with somebody and we were talking about, I don't know, I think it was Julie or something with Amtrak. And Amtrak in the United States is a train service. And so they have this AI assistant where it, you know, where's my train? What, like pretty straightforward, you know, dialect. But I could see, to your point, like if your services are a little bit more complex, like let's not completely avoid human interaction, if anything. Like, of course, there's a time and place, and there are certain opportunities to fully leverage and celebrate AI and the functionality, the capabilities that it has, and chatbots and whatnot. But at some point as well, sometimes people just want to talk to another person. And I think that's reasonable enough. And I also would go as far as like, the smaller the company, I think the more important, and of course you have limited resources, so this isn't really very helpful, but the smaller the organization, the more powerful that individual touch point of somebody actually speaking to the end consumer or user or whatever it may be, on like what they're experiencing, or frankly why they're reaching out, because there's something that's not working. And they were so moved by whatever that experience was, whether they're annoyed about how much they paid for it, whether something is broken, but you'll get insights from it. But I don't think you would get the same insights from that interaction if that person was just automatically put into like some sort of AI funnel. It's different. I don't envy the challenge that small organizations have with that, because it's like, hey, you need to do everything and you need to do everything well. It's a challenge. It's a real big challenge.
There's a in the business we run, there's a interesting find we have. So we are sort of streamlining performance management through a chatbot. Okay, so the basis assumption is you could be giving a right now in companies you give let's say your feedback towards a survey. Okay, so that's it. Typically, we decided to make this a little bit more conversational, and actually, the robot is actually reaching out to people to ask about what did you think about your interactions with Ricardo. And these conversational aspects tend to go, and this was an interesting finding. Our assumption was the robot is going to be able to be conversational. There's going to be some attrition, as in I don't want to talk to a robot, and this doesn't really feel
It's
natural.
gotten good though. Sometimes you don't even know you're talking to a robot.
And we find super interesting is precisely younger generations are actually more comfortable in saying things to a robot that would say to a person. Okay, and this ties a lot with I don't want to the usual joke we make. Gen Zs don't want to pick up phones and so on. But this is actually happening, and it's crazy the amount of feedback we get through a robot that we wouldn't get through a person. They wouldn't confine that with a colleague, maybe with a colleague, but not with their manager. And now they're doing it through a robot, and we can take that information and do a lot with it. So
Yeah, the feedback loop in terms of really, I think there's an accountability component here, especially like with this feedback loop for building of high performing teams, because I don't know, like within an organization, there's number one, there's power dynamics. There can be like a fear component, some a fear of like potentially like losing one's job. Like, I mean, these things come into play, but with that type of feedback loop with potentially a robot AI and everything, like that end person doing that survey, they really have no skin in the game. Like they're not really on anybody's side except their own of like that they want a good experience. So yeah, I think you're going to get some very clear information. And I mean, like, let's be honest, so it's those tools are great in terms of like, hey, like marking certain words, like it's a survey just in another form. It's like, oh yeah, I really liked speaking with Ricardo. It's like liked potentially auto generates kind of like a star, like a yes indicator, like yes it was good or no it was bad. And of course then there's going to be like a little bit of like, let's call it the garbage, where it's like it couldn't really tell what exactly it was. But I think a majority of the time it's going to be able to tell you it's a survey just in another format, that like yes something was good or no it wasn't good. Do you feel like that that feedback loop helps to kind of maintain a little bit of the momentum if like a team is like on a good path, like actually getting constant, well let me ask you this, constant good or bad feedback? Like how do you have a suggestion on how to go about good feedback? I will, let's say this. Good feedback's easy. Hard feedback, bad feedback is sometimes less easy. So like, what's your way about going about it? Do you celebrate people publicly or no?
so there's a hidden part to this which we found. I found it several times in my past experience, and I still find it in every single of these companies that we work with, which is, and this is human behavior, it's natural as is, which is the human bias takes away a lot of the potential of the feedback. Okay, so, and this is what we're trying to, I don't like the word disrupt because everyone uses it nowadays, but that's what we're trying to change here, which is, in some ways, we've all have been in an organization where there was feedback. Feedback was never really that good. It was probably it was, amongst peers, we would say good things about each other. No one would really take the toll on, I don't really like Jane, so I'm just gonna, or at least I have actual factual information that Jane should not be in this company, but I'm not gonna expose that because that's not gonna really do any, well, it's gonna do harm to her and not really anything to me. So,
Sure. Yeah.
and because feedback has been this bloated thing, no one really the takes it seriously in a way that, okay, this is going to be really game changing to the organization. Now, I was lucky enough to be in an organization, and actually we built it in that way so that it was openness, all the checklists that I told you, right? Radical candor. We were tough on each other, and the amazing things that came out of it made me want to go into this topic. And it's going to be very hard to change the way organizations see feedback, because there's a lot of biases in small little things. I'll tell you one that is super, super common, which is a manager. Most of the managers were never taught to be managers.
Right.
People managers, meaning. They were never taught to be so things like, how do I report up and down? Or how do I communicate amongst peers? And especially, how do I give feedback? No one really taught me this. Now, what is the most common thing that we see in managers? Managers, which let's call, most of the managers, the average manager is an average manager. It's not a great manager nor a poor manager. It's an average manager. And what we see is they make hiring mistakes, but because there's an ego part of it, they tend to make them prettier. Okay, so
Yeah.
these people should have been let go, but let's just keep on, because I don't want to look like a bad hire. I did
Yeah.
not make a bad hiring decision. Let me just keep that on. Now, the good ones, and I don't think this is done on purpose, but it's just human behavior. The good ones are a threat to me because they might take my job. So let me
Right.
just make them a little bit less good.
Yeah.
You've seen this, right?
Yeah, no, yes, it's like the politics. Oh, it's so annoying. Yes, it happens.
And how do you break this? I only was able to break this by creating what we typically call 360 feedback, right? So everyone comments about everyone. So I'm able to comment on the other person. Now, I tried to implement this before AI, actually. It was funny. I tried to implement this before AI. It meant that if I am the director of 100 people, I need to talk to 100 people, which is, if I talk to them, I had a breakfast every day with each one of them. So it meant that only a quarter later, I was able to actually circle back. So
Wow.
not very scalable, right?
No.
So
Was it
that's why
I think they say it's like that any one person in any position should ultimately only like I think it's like have 5 people or something reporting to them, and then you need to like break it out because it's not digestible. There's no way, to your point, like 100 people, there's no way ever.
I always felt powerless in the sense that who is going to be that intern? How am I going to know the intern is that good? Or I'm only going to know after a few months, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why we sort of went into building this. And now we have sort of an autopilot, a robot that is collecting feedback. And what we present to the owner of the company is just, is there a likelihood of someone churning in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Okay, let me tell him.
Mm.
Is there a friction between two people in different departments or even within the same team? Also, a very common thing is this manager, do I have a good impression on this manager as in this manager is working upwards only, but their direct reports don't.
Yeah,
That happens a
that's
lot, right?
happened. Yeah, that does. Absolutely.
And this is the type of visibility that it's incredible. We didn't have until now. It was every single time that I worked with HR department, they didn't have any possibility of having this visibility.
Right.
And so circling back to the whole thing on feedback, right? So feedback has been this word, right? It's,
It's
well, we
dirty.
have
It's
to
like
do it.
no, it's like it's loaded.
No one really wants to do it because it doesn't really provide any value. Like I
No.
just come from a call with a VC
Also,
days
it's a
that,
lot of work, and the thoughtfulness to do it properly. It's a lot of work if you're going to do it properly, and so I think that's also challenging. It's like there's nothing fast about it generally.
and that's what we're trying to solve, right? So after you give all this feedback to the bot, the bot is intelligent enough to structure all of this. So I actually compared one of the in our first customers, we actually took the opportunity to compare the previous performance review written by a manager and
Yeah,
what he would
interesting.
have written, or what he wrote in the next one after we implemented it. It was crazy, like the amount of information there, and ultimately, if this comes to preventing the exit of people that are super high performers but are
Right.
unhappy, and high performers are very quick to churn. Like they're very quick to take the decisions on, I'm going to go to a new company. So you need to be very
Yeah.
fast to predict them.
Right.
Making the dismissals you need to make because they were there, you knew they were there, but you never had really the data to back them up. And in a few countries, this is actually an issue. So Southern European countries, the law is very protective of the employees. So you sort of need to create this information or this data that proves that the employee is not performing, as well as this person should have been promoted 2 quarters ago. Let's do it now.
Right. 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 It's interesting because I'd be curious just I mean, from working in corporate America, I think that there's some good points of friction, say, meaning that like let's take away like how people feel personally about one another, but then like I go back to some prior organizations that like there was like a push and pull between, let's say, marketing, like I'm a marketer at the end of the day, and various different organizations. And I'd go as far as to say like it needed to be there. And it was good for or it was good actually for progression or getting like shipping things or getting things out the door. And it worked. So like let me ask you, okay, so we're talking about feedback and everything. Is there like how does one what I'm trying to get like how does one disentangle, or maybe in some cases you want it entangled, I don't know, but I'm going initially, how does one disentangle their personal opinions of somebody just from like a person to person standpoint versus their ability to say do a job, because I do think that those are two separate things where sometimes people are like, well, I like this person or I dislike this person but they're incredibly good at their job, or I like this person and they're bad at their job. Ideally, best case scenario is like you like the person and they're great at their job, like that's that's of course the ultimate goal. But like from a feedback loop, like is there a way to disentangle like personal feelings from the actual deliverables of say like what the requirements are of that job?
This is a very tricky one. There's always personal preferences, and especially in smaller companies, they play a big role. In larger companies, not so much. The way we try to solve this, and so the traditional way is, I cannot stand this person, even though he's a top performer. Let me talk to an HR person that hopefully is capable of mediating this. We're trying a different approach. I like the results so far, which is it is fine for you not to get along with this employee. Now, our robot makes you scrutinize that feeling.
Mm, okay.
And this scrutiny is actually fairly simple to achieve, which is how is this behavior that you don't like affecting you? So the person needs to start talking about feelings, which is a hard task for any human being. The second one is, can you give me examples of how this behavior is affecting your performance or the other person's performance? Because deep down, a lot of these things are not backed up by examples and we lose track and it's all feeling based. We need to
Right.
put some facts on it. And while we put these facts, the person that is ranting about the other starts getting in, it starts convincing them that maybe this is not so bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Right.
finally, it's great. So when you start putting the examples,
It's perspective. It provides the perspective. It provides the benchmark for like, oh, I was really annoyed in that situation, but it actually wasn't nearly as bad when I start thinking about it again. Time also has a way of kind of easing those, so
yeah, you get that perspective turns into let me, and we see that a lot in the feedbacks. I actually need to draw this chart because I need to put a number on it.
it sounds
On sort of,
interesting. Yes, yes, do it.
it's sort of agreeability. So versus my initial bad feedback, how much do I agree it over time as I write that down? And we see that inflection when we start doing examples, which is, I think there's, when people are asked for examples, they get more compassionate about the other, or at least start understanding some of the things, and you start seeing that inflection point in agreeability with the initial rant. And then the final touch is, how can we make this person, what are your suggestions for improvement? And this is where we see the peak of, I really like to give this feedback because now I had to structure on how do I want to see this person behaving? Because ultimately that's what you want, right? You're giving a feedback, but what you want to pass is that message. How do I feel comfortable with this person behaving? And this is incredible information. This is, when you get to this level, it becomes very actionable for the manager to see this.
Mhm.
In very strict scenarios, the robot replies back to the original feedback giver and says, "This is such a case that I'm still a robot. I'm not going to interact with you, the person, right? So this is the perfect case in which you should be consulting either with your manager on how to approach the situation, or even if you feel comfortable,
Mhm.
you should approach directly the person to solve this issue. Ideally, we will go into a coaching method in this robot, but in which we can actually advise on how to do this. This is very tricky because psychology in
Yeah,
itself,
yeah.
psychologists will definitely not like our attempting to go into this more coaching part. But we will try to work with them. Actually, we were already talking to universities to precisely work with them and on how
Interesting.
to
Yeah,
advise
yeah.
these situations. But yeah, so wrapping up. So you start by asking what the situation is, examples and suggestions for improvement, and you see the
No, it's
comfort
very
that the
it's very interesting because I think, I mean, aside from, where you're going with like building out the coaching components, like from, what I also take from it, is what a beautiful opportunity for, I don't know, at least something, whatever that is depends. Let's say you have a high performer and maybe you like they're clearly, like, with the 360 review and everything, they're also flagged as somebody that's highly capable, if anything, and I think that's an opportunity to also sidebar with them as well. It's like, hey, I want to keep you happy and motivated, and I want to keep you growing, and potentially like build in like a path to whatever they want, like I mean, whatever that looks like, or whatever would also behoove the organization. So let's say you tag some, say you acknowledge somebody that like has the ability, with the appropriate training and mentorship to go into C-suite. Or let's say that same person is like an amazing at what they do, but like they're like, no, 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 I don't want to do C-suite. I'd like to stay right here as a solid individual contributor. I'm happy to train other people. I don't want to become a manager. Like, what a missed opportunity that, like, if you take that person, like that same person that's like regarded as highly affected, works well with their team, that like maybe you like, hey, as an organization, like, hey, we'd actually would like to have you move into the C-suite, but then they're honest enough that they can say like, no, no, I don't want to do that. If you take that same person and force them into the path of C-suite or management or whatever, you're going to lose them. And same goes for like people that are, say, like underperforming or struggling or what, like, I think that there's also, it looks like an opportunity to like acknowledge that, step in, intervene, provide training, whatever that may, or or potentially like also separate, like if it really comes down to that. But I think that having that information can just be helpful. I don't think it's helpful for any organization to have too much, a lot of attrition or people churning. Like, that's not good for anybody. So and I think in terms of like, if you have attrition, if you're keeping on people that aren't performing or like aren't really helping kind of carry their load and everything, that ultimately is going to kill the momentum that a high performing team has at the end of the day. I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but
no. And what do we see? I think so. When it comes to individual contributors, it's typically a soft skill that will make them shine. Sorry, a hard skill that will make them shine, and they can just go outside and learn it and so on. What we see in managers is it's a soft skill that is very tied also to the management style of the company, and this is not taught by anyone. And so the problem is no one really taught you how to be a manager in this company. And if you perform well, if you perform badly, is anyone actually going to train you on that? Or they're just going to be dumped into, take the HR, department should give you a Harvard Business Review article to see how you should be a manager. And And it's one of the most recoverable cases that we see in these companies, and it boils down to it's an interesting loop. I actually need to write something down about this because it will also structure my thoughts. But what I tell to these founders is what defines a good manager is one thing. The discrepancy of what they say about their performance for their direct reports and what the company sees.
mm,
Okay. Okay? And how do you see this happening? This happens typically when you do the whole performance review, you grade your direct reports, and you go into a calibration mode. And the great managers, nothing changes. What they said is what they leave, and it's not about arguing. Oh, this person is better than. No, it's just they go in, they
It's
deliver
accurate.
their
It's
results.
accuracy. Yeah.
It's already calibrated, as in they have 20% top performers, they have 20% bottom performers that need to be acted on. The others need to be potentially promoted or raised. I have 60%, which are average performers, and they come in here like this. These are the great managers. Now, let's go into the bad managers. They come with 60% top performers, and then people ask, but how are they so good? Like, let's try to compare them. And then they all like calibrate it down, and then they come out as in, what did I do wrong? Like, why did the other like, so can this person be trained? For sure. Actually, what the conversation we have with them, or at least the founders have with them afterwards, is your job is to also be critical about your direct reports, correct the mistakes you made, because you will make them, okay? And after this conversation, the whole flow changes typically. And this happens, we see more bloating of these results in technology and a few other more supporting roles. And if the conversation is actually taken with the person and they need to raise the bar and then so on, that typically corrects course the whole trajectory of that manager, and then they start hiring better,
Yeah.
firing when they need to, and it's a very correctable situation actually.
I like this. I like this. Do you feel it? Because I feel like we've gone through like, we're talking about practical strategies for building high performing teams. I mean, we're defining that, talking about the foundation that it's built on, hiring and like onboarding to some degree. And then, of course, like celebrating the people that are performing and then helping the people that are underperforming. Is there something like, do you think that like, are we missing anything? And we talked about measuring KPIs and everything. I guess I'm just trying to feel like if there's,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's anything that we've missed to talk to speak on.
Yeah, there's one particular thing which actually ties the back to the founder mode I just told you in the beginning, which can be confused also with micromanaging, which is
Let's
you as a
make that
manager should.
distinction. Absolutely.
There's a bit of this binary situation between micromanaging and being a loose manager. I take what my direct reports tell me and so on. And typically, things are never binary, right? So there's a middle ground, which is you're not being a micromanager, and you shouldn't be afraid to skip the level and tell your manager or your direct reports, "Hey, I'm just gonna touch base with your guys. Is it fine? Because actually, I want you to do the same with them. Because otherwise, the network, this is not a pure network, it's just a hierarchy. And as a director or a manager, you need to understand the pulse of the organization. Besides whatever frameworks that my company is building to actually streamline this, you still need the human touch. What we want is to
Yes.
provide data and simplify this whole process. But deep down, organizations are people, and you still need to keep these levels and talk to the so that's a common misconception, which is, oh no, I'm not going to skip the level because I would be a micromanager. Probably it's something that we try to avoid, or at least tell our clients, just avoid that.
Right.
It, you should be able to talk to anyone. And then just generally, as I said, right, set the example, right? And this
Yes.
can be
Yes.
for, yeah, I cannot be telling my people to work their asses off in a deliverable, which sometimes happens, right? We need to be over the weekend if I'm not there. Like, I will need to be there over the weekend as well, and that's how it is. Otherwise, it's just going to be you're not going
Absolutely.
to get the buy-in.
And then yeah, absolutely. And to counter that as well, it's like if I think there's also that balance, like if you're expecting, say, weekend work on an ongoing basis, then that's also like if there's a pattern of it, then it seems like there's a need for additional headcount or reprioritization because, people need a break sometimes. I mean, assuming that like, assuming like whatever the week looks like. But I think that there's ultimately that balance at the end of the day, which is completely fair.
That's
I
also
mean,
part of the setting the example, by the way, even in taking time off, which is something that I, I keep on saying, but I actually don't do much and I didn't do that well in the past. Enjoying the time off and be disconnected and
yeah.
having fun with your kids, send pictures of your kids on the beach
Yeah.
to the whole company. This is what time off looks like.
Yeah. Like
Enjoy.
actually do it. Absolutely. I'm totally tracking with you. Ricardo, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I think that this has really been interesting. I actually personally feel like I'm going to be going off there, going and reading about some of the things that you've touched on. Because I'm specifically founder mode. I'm like, I don't know much about that, so I need to go check that out. But I will say, even like just as from my perspective as somebody that's worked in management, I've also worked as an individual contributor. Like it's like I'm buying off on like these things that you've mentioned in terms of clear objectives, radical candor, and autonomy. Like they really resonate with me. And I think that, to your point, like showing up with what you're asking for of your team, I think that's really like the step one of really building any sort of these high performing teams, is that like the number one leader shows up in the way that they're asking their team, like period. Like if it's not starting there, it's never happening. But then like really like the thoughtfulness for hiring and building out and clarity of those clear objectives. And to your point, I think you mentioned, you're like, hey, print it out. Like whatever those clear objectives are, printing it out and putting it on your wall so you see it on, or like your desktop screensaver. It's like you need to see that daily because it needs to be reinforced. I'll even find it's I've definitely been at periods of my life where I'm like, all right, what am I trying to do? Like, what is my objective at the end of the day? So having that one guiding principle, does it answer yes to that guiding principle? If it answers yes, you do it. If it answers no, you keep going. Everything else has got to drop.
And there's even a let me just add that one point there, which is we recommend all the teams we work with to track their objectives weekly.
Hmm.
The majority of the companies reply back with, but we do it monthly or even annually.
That is not fast enough and does not account for any sort of, that's too slow.
And I also get asked with a different thing, which is, can you integrate with my ERP so you get the metrics directly from there so no one needs to take extra work? And I asked them, how do you ensure that your direct reports know their numbers if I'm extracting that information directly from the ERP? What I want is for them to fill in those numbers and comment those numbers every single week and say, why are they on top? Why are they below the expectation? If you don't know your numbers,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so ties back with exactly what you were saying, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Ricardo, this has been a wonderful conversation. I realize I've kept you quite a bit of time. I normally don't like take the entire window. But let me ask you this. Would you like to provide a quick pitch to, your organization or yourself? Like how can people find you?
Sure. So we're building a company called Fit Forward, which is sort of a tricking. So we're basically playing with the word feedback, but now we want to make it forward because feedback has been a little bit back in the past
Yeah,
few
yeah.
years. And we're building it. You can find me on Twitter with rbatista19 and also on LinkedIn with Batista Ricardo. So the other way around. And so we're building it right now. Interesting. We're trying to revamp the whole feedback as I told you. I think I already went through exactly what we do, so we don't really need to go over that.
It sounds
I
fun
just
and
want to
interesting, I have to say. It sounds really, I think it's,
amazing.
I've been at organizations that don't do 360 and I'm always like, why? Why not? I find it actually frustrating when it's always top down. I'm like, what in the
It's
world?
too
But yeah,
much work. It's true. It's
yeah,
true. Like 360 means the manager needs to think, who are the 10 people that have interacted the most with my report,
it's a lot of
direct
work.
report number one.
So
Let
much.
me nudge them and let me follow up on them 3 times. It's crazy.
That's a whole
And
nother
every
job.
I remember spending like 15 to 20 hours over each cycle, like, and it was quarterly. So it's, yeah. So we're trying to fix that, and we will fix on other stuff that can be enabled by AI, and AI has been a huge helper in this. And I think, deep down, what I tell my customers is, so let me tell you what are the two things that you're not going to get if you don't have proper performance management.
Yeah. Yeah.
One is you don't really have the multiplier effect of high performers. High performers produce 10 times more the average performers, okay? And now with AI, I sometimes say a little bit more than 10 times.
I like it.
And now you don't really know the high performers, or you don't really understand who are the rising stars in your company. You probably are not doing also the churn management, sorry,
Right,
the
right.
lower performer management, which needs, if these guys don't really get out, then the top performers don't really get motivated. And ultimately, this is, a high performing team has in every single one of these guys, of these employees, a very big sense of fulfillment. And now that you mentioned you wanted to read some of the things that I mentioned here, have a read about, this came out a few days ago.
Okay. What is it?
So Loom, you know the Loom platform, the platform in which you can just screen record your you can record your screen. It's called Loom. There was a
LOOM?
it was LOOM, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
It was sold to Atlassian, I believe. So one of the founders, so they were sold by almost $1 billion. And one of the founders, this was done, the acquisition was like maybe a year ago, more, tops. One of the founders, Vinay, actually wrote a thesis on how his sense of fulfillment has gone down to zero.
Oh,
Because
I
he
was it.
has all.
I am rich. I have no idea what to do. Is that what it is?
Exactly. I got that.
Oh my
You gotta
God,
read
such
it.
good clickbait. I totally want to read this.
But it is amazing. Like, imagine you have so much money on your account and you don't really have a project you want to work on. And I think he broke up with his girlfriend. I don't know. There was a lot of
Oh
things.
my gosh, he sold the startup for $975 million. That's some money.
Yeah, I think he kept, I don't know if it was 100 and something, or not even 100, but he has money to do whatever we want.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't have a sense of fulfillment. It's a crazy article. You should read about
This
it.
is interesting that, I mean, to your point, I mean, I'm projecting here if anything, but it's like, busy work. He like kept it he kept busy, and now that he's not busy, it's obvious that he's like, potentially, in his case it sounds like he's like, I'm unhappy, or this does nothing for me. It's like, but I will say, let's be real though, money helps a lot of things, but like it doesn't help everything. So like, I mean, for like, when you don't have money, money's important.
You've always left because of a lack of sense of fulfillment in that place. That's usually either because you're going to a place where there's a better sense of fulfillment, or that one just doesn't suffice it anymore. This is what people crave for. And for this to happen, they need to feel. And by recognizing, a simple measure is you do performance management, you let go of the best one, you let go of the worst ones, and you keep the best ones, right? It's a multiplying effect, and people then challenge each other. It's brilliant. So
Yeah.
um,
I
I
also just
think
like to, I mean,
everyone should.
you've mentioned if you like let go of like the lowest performance, but I'm also like, or rehabilitate the lowest performance. I feel like that,
Exactly.
preferably that first more than
Exactly.
anything. So, Ricardo, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much here. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. Join the Idea Citizen LinkedIn group and share this episode with a friend.